Welcome back. This time you've given us a real thought-provoking collection of ideas to dig into. We're going deep on Alexander Karp's The Technological Republic. And just to set the stage, this book has some serious endorsements right off the bat. Walter Isaacson, he calls it a, freethinker's manifesto. And then you have David Ignatius over at the Washington Post. He describes Karp as a querdenker. It's a German word meaning, an orthogonal thinker, somebody who approaches things from a really unique angle. So right away, we're dealing with some big ideas here about technology's role in America, what it's really for, and how it ties into, well, our national identity and the whole idea of the greater good.
Yeah, that description, that querdenker thing that Ignatius uses,
Yeah.
it really is spot on. This isn't just another, Silicon Valley tell-all or a, standard tech industry analysis. It's different. What Karp does is he blends the hands-on experience of Palantir, his company, with his own, well, pretty unique view of political philosophy. It's like, imagine getting a peek inside a major tech player, but then at the same time zooming out to look at the very essence of American innovation itself.
Okay, so for you, our listeners, let's break this down. Our goal here isn't just to give you a dry book report, right? You could find a summary anywhere. We want to get to the heart of Karp's arguments, find those surprising nuggets of insight, and connect them all in a way that, makes you go, aha. We're in some deep intellectual waters here, no doubt, but we're going to keep it engaging and, most importantly, understandable. No information overload, I promise.
Absolutely. And there are a few big themes that really jump out from Karp's work that we'll be diving into. We're going to start by looking at this historical partnership between the U.S. government and, the early tech industry. This might surprise you, to be honest. It's a whole different perspective on how things got started. And then from there, we'll look at how Silicon Valley's focus has, shifted over time, the big questions that AI brings up, and of course, this absolutely critical issue of national culture and shared purpose in our rapidly changing technological world.
So the book kicks off with this, it's a bold statement. He says Silicon Valley has, in some fundamental way, lost its way. That's a strong opening, What's at the core of that argument?
Yeah, he comes out swinging, doesn't he? What Karp's getting at is that the early success of American technology, back in the early to mid-20th century, it was really intertwined with this partnership, this collaboration between those rising tech companies and the U.S. government. It's a level of partnership that today, well, would be pretty much unimaginable. He's stressing that the main driving force back then, it wasn't just about creating the next, cool consumer gadget. It was about tackling major industrial challenges and, importantly, national challenges. The big takeaway here is that American tech dominance, it didn't come from pure, go-it-alone individualism. It was more like a strategic alliance, working hand in hand with national goals. A big contrast to how we see Silicon Valley today.
Right, because the image we often have is Silicon Valley being this independent force of innovation, almost operating outside the traditional systems of government of those big institutions.
Exactly. And Karp, he really drives this point home by bringing up President Franklin Roosevelt's letter to Vannevar Bush. This is back in 1944, right? World War II is winding down, and Roosevelt's already thinking ahead. He talks about the unique experiment of using scientific expertise for, military goals during the war.
Right.
But even more importantly, he says, he believes the lessons from this collaboration, this close working relationship between the government and scientists, well, they could be used profitably in times of peace. To address big problems like public health, national well-being, things like that. He saw this partnership continuing strong.
So this wasn't just a temporary thing, a wartime measure that naturally faded away once the conflict was over.
Not according to Karp, no. He argues that this union of science in the state, it was actually pretty unremarkable back then. It was seen as, a normal, logical way to do things. You align national goals with technological progress. And it created this environment where engineers, these innovators, were highly respected, almost like celebrities. He mentions how Vannevar Bush was called the man who may win the war back in 42. Think about that. A government official, an engineer, seen as a key figure in a global war. And the public, their fascination wasn't just limited to wartime heroes. Scientists like Marie Curie and Albert Einstein, their work, their discoveries, those were front-page news.
It's hard to picture that kind of sustained public fascination with, fundamental science happening today, at least not consistently. We're more drawn to the latest consumer tech or, celebrity gossip.
You're right. And that brings us to this shift that Karp describes. It was a slow but significant move, toward a Silicon Valley that's very consumer-driven. He says that the tech giants of today, they've largely prioritized the consumer market, focusing on things like online advertising, social media platforms. And sometimes, he argues, this comes at the cost of those bigger, more fundamental advancements that we saw earlier.
The book talks about this, I don't know, somewhat cynical view of that modern tech slogan, change the world. It can feel a little empty when it's attached to, yet another photo sharing app. I can see where he's coming from.
Yeah, the change the world thing's become a bit of a cliche, hasn't it? Karp, he points out this growing skepticism within Silicon Valley about working with the government, about pursuing national goals. The focus shifted more towards individual needs and desires, rather than those big collective efforts we saw earlier. He argues that the market, well, it rewarded this less ambitious approach to technology's potential.
And this is where he brings up the idea of technological agnostics, which I thought was a really insightful term.
What's fascinating here is this idea of, this whole generation of programmers, engineers, incredibly talented people who are, well, more than willing to serve the needs of, capitalist culture, to build those apps, those platforms that make money, that grab market share. But there's this hesitation to ask those really fundamental questions, those ethical questions about what should be built, and maybe even more importantly, for what purpose. Like, they'll build amazing algorithms to optimize ad clicks, but they're not as interested in, the bigger societal impact of their work. It's like having these master builders who can perfectly follow blueprints, but they never stop to ask if the building itself is, actually serving the community, if it's for a good cause.
He even quotes the physicist Percy Williams Bridgman, who said, "Scientists aren't responsible for the facts that are in nature. It's their job to find the facts. There's no sin connected with it, no morals." Karp seems to be suggesting that this kind of amoral viewpoint, it's continued, maybe even become deeply embedded within Silicon Valley.
That's a key point. This idea that the scientist, the engineer, is just a neutral observer, just delivering facts or lines of code, somehow removed from the ethical, the moral implications of their work, that's what Karp sees as a real problem. It leads to, I don't know, maybe a kind of ethical passivity and unwillingness to really grapple with the potential consequences of these technological advancements.
And the book argues that the rise of artificial intelligence, it's really brought these issues into the spotlight, hasn't it? It's not just about, optimizing a user's experience anymore.
Absolutely. Karp's point is that AI, which is, for the first time, a serious and rapidly evolving challenge to human creative dominance, it makes these questions of national identity and purpose even more urgent. We could maybe ignore them before, but the potential of AI, things like those advanced language models, autonomous robots to reshape the world, we can't afford to put those discussions off any longer. This is the time to decide who we are and what we aspire to be as a society, especially when it comes to this powerful new technology. You see, AI can learn, it can create increasingly complex outputs. It's not just automating simple tasks anymore. It's moving into areas we thought were uniquely human, making us rethink our role, our values.
He makes this interesting comparison with some of our, geopolitical rivals, suggesting that maybe they're more attuned to the long-term impacts of this AI-driven world on their nations.
Karp's analysis here is interesting. He observes that a lot of our geopolitical competitors, they're often led by individuals who have a very personal stake in the success, the stability of their countries. It's almost like a founder in Silicon Valley. Their power, their wealth, their legacies, it's all tied up in how their nation does. And Karp says this makes them acutely aware, very responsive to the needs of their people, even if their methods are, authoritarian, even ruthless sometimes.
And that naturally leads into the discussion about this new kind of arms race, as he calls it, in the field of AI, particularly its military applications.
Exactly. Karp, he really underscores the dangers of hesitation, of inaction in this area. He says that having the ability to develop those advanced AI-powered military tools and then being willing to use them if necessary, well, that remains a vital part of international relations, of national security, especially in this new technological landscape.
But he also highlights this internal conflict, right? There's a lot of resistance within Silicon Valley to working on offensive AI applications for the military, even though, those same engineers, researchers, they'll happily create algorithms for targeted advertising or other consumer-focused tech. He gives that example of Microsoft employees protesting a defense contract with the U.S. Army back in 2019. It really illustrates this tension.
It's a striking paradox, isn't it? These highly skilled engineers, they have these strong moral objections to contributing to defense technology, but they're fine with building systems that track and monetize our every move online. Karp points out the irony, the very peace and freedom that allows them to protest, to voice their opposition. It's largely made possible by the military they're reluctant to support.
This leads into his pretty significant claim that the atomic age is coming to an end, and we're now entering the software century, where AI will likely determine the winners and losers of future conflicts, and shape global power.
What's changing at a fundamental level is the relationship between hardware and software. For most of the 20th century, software was there to control and improve hardware. But now, with AI, with things like machine learning, neural networks, well, software is taking the lead. It's the intelligent algorithms, running on everything from drones to missile defense systems. They're making recommendations, sometimes even autonomous decisions, guiding the hardware. And the challenge Karp keeps coming back to is that the very people who can build these crucial AI systems, they're often hesitant, sometimes even opposed, to working with the U.S. military.
And then there's a sense of worry in the book about what Karp calls the hollowing out of the American mind. And he's clear that this isn't just a Silicon Valley problem.
This is a key part of Karp's bigger argument. He sees this hollowing out not as some isolated tech industry thing, but a wider societal trend. He calls it an abandonment of belief. And he argues that the growing intolerance we see among intellectual elites towards, traditional religious belief, well, that's a symptom of a decline in open discussion, a weakening of those shared fundamental values.
He even suggests that many Americans are afraid to take a clear stance on important issues because they're so worried about offending someone. He calls it the new prime directive, to offend no one.
Right. Karp says that even though we might technically have the freedom to disagree, this intense focus on avoiding offense, well, it's stifled real intellectual exploration, that honest expression of deeply held beliefs. People are hesitant to advocate for anything specific, anything that might be seen as putting one set of values above another. And it leads to this kind of self-censorship.
The book also touches on those debates about Western civilization courses in universities, how there's been this shift away from a universal narrative towards one that's seen as more specific, maybe even sectarian. He even brings up Frederick L. Chayette's critique in that context.
Right, and that's another example of this trend that Karp sees. There's this widespread questioning, this deconstruction of those accepted narratives, those belief systems we used to take for granted. Chayette's argument, that what was presented as this universal objective view of history was actually rooted in a specific perspective. Well, it reflects a big change in how we approach history, culture, knowledge, both in academia and in society.
So after laying out all these challenges, the book moves into part 3, where he talks about developing what he calls the engineering mindset as a way forward. What exactly does he mean by that?
For Karp, the engineering mindset is like a mental framework, a way of thinking that helps us deal with the complexities and uncertainties of the modern world. It's about being willing to face the world as it is, not how we wish it was. And that means close observation, setting aside our preconceived judgments and focusing on finding practical, workable solutions to real-world problems. He even uses this great analogy, quoting the artist Lucian Freud, "I try to paint what is actually there."
So it's about being grounded, realistic, and focused on solutions. But how does this mindset help us rebuild the technological republic, which is the title of the next section?
The key is to take that engineering instinct, that focus on solutions, and direct it towards achieving national goals, things we decide on together. But of course, that means we first need to define who we are or aspire to be as a nation in the 21st century. Karp also raises this interesting question about piety and its price. He asks whether we're actually hurting ourselves by undervaluing public service, with low salaries, this skepticism towards incentives. He uses Jerome Powell's relatively low salary as the Fed chair as an example.
The idea being that if we don't make public service attractive, we might be missing out on the best and brightest, the people who could really make a difference.
Exactly. So Karp suggests we need to build what he calls an ownership society and a founder culture within government. That means leaders, public servants, they feel like they have a stake in their success and the good outcomes they create for the nation.
And this brings us to the importance of national culture, of having a shared purpose. This seems to be a major theme throughout the book.
Karp argues that having a strong shared culture, a common language, understanding of history, those unifying narratives, those are what bring people together in a meaningful way. It's more than just basic survival. It's about deeper connections. He acknowledges that it's tough to define national culture precisely, especially nowadays. He even mentions Macron's statement about there not being one single French culture.
But the book also presents a different perspective, highlighting Yves Jago's argument for, preserving a shared national identity without claiming that it's superior or excluding anyone.
Right. Jago's point is that maintaining that cultural foundation doesn't have to mean shutting out diversity or claiming superiority.
Hmm.
His concern, and Karp agrees, is that abandoning the idea of a shared culture altogether, well, it risks fragmenting society, eroding our collective identity. He uses Lee Kuan Yew's efforts in Singapore as a case study, you know, promoting Mandarin, building a unified identity. It happened alongside Singapore's impressive economic rise.
So maybe it's about reviving, strengthening that shared culture, not getting rid of it in the name of inclusivity if we want to thrive in the long run.
That's a key takeaway from Karp's argument. A strong sense of shared understanding, of collective identity, it can be a huge advantage, helping a nation face internal and external challenges.
And the book ends by stressing the importance of what he calls an aesthetic point of view and talking about how founder-led companies tend to do better. He refers to Rudiger Fallenbach's research here. How does this tie into everything else?
Karp argues that for real, game-changing innovation, you often need some distance from the immediate pressures of the market, those short-term demands. Companies with a strong vision, usually coming from the founder, they tend to perform better over time. The challenge, as Karp puts it, is to take the energy, the creativity of this new generation, those brilliant, often iconoclastic tech people, and get them working towards goals that are bigger than just individual gain or market demands. It means cultivating that aesthetic point of view, a guiding vision rooted in a clear understanding of national purpose on a societal level.
So, to sum up this deep dive into the technological republic, Karp is calling for a renewed sense of national purpose, a smarter, more ethical approach to technology, especially AI, and a recognition that having a shared national culture is vital for a healthy, resilient society.
Yes, he wants us to return to that ambition, that purpose-driven innovation we saw in those earlier eras of American technology, but in a way that fits the complexities and challenges of the 21st century.
And for you, our listener, we'll leave you with this. What do you think the right balance is between individual innovation and our collective national goals? How can we best use this engineering mindset to face the challenges we have today? And what role does a shared understanding of our culture, our history, play in building the kind of successful technological republic that Karp talks about? These are big questions, and we encourage you to keep thinking about them. Maybe even pick up the Technological Republic and dive in yourself. We hope this deep dive has given you some new facts, some insights that stick with you without being overwhelming. Until next time.